My children treated me like a worthless burden for 23 years, arguing over my measly pension while I lived in their garage. They had absolutely no idea I owned 52 acres of prime desert property in Scottsdale, Arizona, worth over $3.2 million. What they'll discover in my will after I'm gone will shatter everything they thought they knew about their poor, helpless mother. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Follow my story until the very end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches across the world. At 74, I never imagined I'd be orchestrating the biggest shock of my family's life from beyond the grave. My name is Beatrice Henley, though my children stopped calling me anything but Mom in that tired, exasperated tone years ago. For more than 2 decades, my 4 children, Jonathan, Melissa, Christopher, and Amanda, have treated me like an unwanted inheritance they received along with their father's modest debts and endless responsibilities. When my beloved husband, Walter, passed away in March 2001, I thought my children would rally around me, help me navigate the crushing loneliness and financial uncertainty that suddenly consumed my world. Instead, they descended like a pack of wolves who'd caught the scent of weakness, each one convinced they knew better than I did about everything from my living arrangements to my grocery shopping habits. "Mother, you simply cannot continue living in this enormous house by yourself," Jonathan had declared just 6 weeks after Walter's funeral, standing in my living room with his briefcase in one hand and a stack of real estate brochures in the other. At 52, my eldest son had inherited his father's engineering mind, but none of his compassion. "It's completely impractical. The maintenance costs alone will eat through whatever savings Dad left you within 2 years." I was still wearing Walter's old sweater to bed every night, still setting 2 coffee cups out of habit each morning, still hearing his voice in every creak of the floorboards we'd walked together for 38 years. But Jonathan was already calculating square footage and property taxes like I was a business problem that needed solving. Melissa, my only daughter and someone I'd once considered my closest confidant, nodded along with her brother's assessment. "Mom, Jonathan's absolutely right. You're 74 years old. What if you fall down those stairs? What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" She spoke in that patronizing tone people reserve for small children and elderly relatives they consider mentally diminished. "We're not trying to control your life. We're trying to protect you." Christopher, always the follower, chimed in with his own concerns about the neighborhood changing, property values declining, and my inability to maintain the yard work Walter had always handled. And Amanda, my youngest, at 45, kept talking about maximizing your assets and making smart financial decisions for your future care needs. Future care needs, as if I were already 1 foot in the grave, just waiting for them to decide which nursing home would be most convenient for their visiting schedules. Within 4 months of Walter's death, they'd worn me completely down. The combination of grief, loneliness, and their relentless pressure finally broke my resistance. I agreed to sell the house Walter and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised 4 children, celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, and planned to grow old together watching grandchildren play in the same backyard where their parents had once built snow forts and climbed apple trees. "You'll be so much happier somewhere smaller and more manageable," Melissa assured me as I signed the real estate contract with trembling hands. "And this way you'll have a nice nest egg to ensure you're comfortable for the rest of your life." The house sold for $287,000. Not a fortune, but more money than Walter and I had ever possessed at one time. For exactly 2 weeks, I felt a flicker of independence, imagining how I might use this financial cushion to create a new chapter of my life, maybe travel to places Walter and I had always talked about visiting. That fantasy died quickly when my children presented me with their plan for my nest egg. "We've set up a family trust," Jonathan explained, spreading papers across my kitchen table like a general planning a military campaign. "This way your money is protected and professionally managed. We'll make sure all your needs are met, and you won't have to worry about complicated financial decisions or being taken advantage of by scammers who target elderly people." The way he said elderly people made it clear he was talking about me. At 74, I was apparently too senile to be trusted with my own money. The trust was structured so that Jonathan, as the eldest and most financially savvy, would serve as the primary trustee. Melissa would handle my day-to-day expenses and healthcare decisions. Christopher would manage my transportation needs and household maintenance, and Amanda would oversee my social activities and ensure I stayed engaged with appropriate activities for someone my age. They divided me up like a corporation, each taking responsibility for different aspects of managing their increasingly burdensome mother. Where would I live? I asked, the reality of my situation finally sinking in.
Another exchange of glances around the table. Well, Melissa said carefully, we thought you could stay with me and David for a while, just until we find you a nice senior living community. That while turned into 6 months in Melissa's guest room, which quickly became indefinite when every senior living facility they toured was either too expensive, we need to preserve your principal, too far away, how would we visit regularly, or unsuitable for various other reasons that basically boiled down to none of them wanting to spend the trust money on actually ensuring my comfort and independence. Eventually, I ended up in Christopher's converted garage in Phoenix, Arizona. Not by choice, but because it was the most economical solution that allowed them to keep an eye on my well-being while preserving my financial resources for real emergencies. The garage had been converted into what Christopher generously called a mother-in-law suite, though it bore no resemblance to any housing arrangement a person would choose voluntarily. The concrete floors were covered with cheap laminate that never quite felt warm, even in Arizona's blazing summers. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every argument between Christopher and his wife Sandra, every late-night television show, every early morning alarm clock. My suite consisted of a single room with a fold-out bed that left permanent indentations in my spine, a mini refrigerator that barely held 3 days' worth of groceries, a microwave perched on a card table, and a bathroom so small I had to sit sideways on the toilet to close the door. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional humiliation of my new existence. Every month, I'd hand over my $1,847 Social Security check to Christopher for household expenses and utilities. When I asked to keep even $50 for personal items, he'd sigh heavily and launch into a lecture about fixed incomes and the rising cost of everything. Mom, you have to understand, supporting an additional person in the household increases our expenses significantly, he'd explain, as if letting me live in his garage was some tremendous act of charity. Your food, your medications, your share of the electricity and water, it all adds up. We're barely breaking even as it is. Meanwhile, Sandra would make pointed comments about the hot water running out faster since I'd moved in, how her grocery bills had doubled, and how they'd had to cancel their vacation plans because of family obligations. Family obligations. That's what I'd become. The worst part wasn't the cramped living conditions or the constant financial guilt trips. It was how my children had started talking to me like I was a child, or worse, like I was losing my mental faculties. "Mom, you asked me that same question yesterday," Amanda would say with exaggerated patience when I inquired about my bank statements or wanted to understand how my trust money was being allocated. "Don't worry your head about complicated financial matters," Jonathan would add, patting my shoulder condescendingly. "That's what we're here for. You just focus on staying healthy and let us handle the grown-up stuff." The grown-up stuff. As if I hadn't managed a household budget for 50 years, raised 4 children, helped Walter build a small but successful plumbing business, and navigated every major financial decision in our family until the day he died. But I learned to play the role they'd assigned me. The confused, grateful elderly mother who needed their constant guidance and protection. When they spoke slowly and loudly, I nodded along. When they made decisions about my life without consulting me, I thanked them for their thoughtfulness. When they treated me like a burden they were nobly shouldering, I apologized for being so much trouble. For 23 years, I perfected this performance, becoming exactly the helpless old woman they believed me to be. They had no idea how carefully I was watching, listening, and planning. What my children didn't know, what nobody in the world knew except a lawyer named Eugene Bartwell in Tucson, Arizona, was that I had been keeping a secret since 1983. A secret that would have changed everything about how they treated me, how they spoke to me, and how they managed what they thought were my pathetically limited resources. In August of 1983, Walter's great-uncle Cornelius died at the age of 89. Uncle Cornelius had been what people politely called a character. A former railroad worker who'd never married, never had children, and spent the last 40 years of his life living alone in a tiny cabin outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. He was the kind of relative families acknowledge at Christmas cards and funerals, but otherwise prefer to forget about. So when a lawyer from Tucson called to inform us that Uncle Cornelius had died and left something to Walter's wife, we assumed it was maybe a few $100s or some old family photographs. What we discovered was that Uncle Cornelius had left me 52 acres of desert land about 30 miles outside of Scottsdale.
It's not worth much right now, the lawyer, Eugene Bartwell, had explained over the phone. Mostly scrub brush and cacti. But Uncle Cornelius seemed to think the area might develop someday. He specifically requested that if you inherit the land, you should consider holding onto it for at least 20 years before making any decisions about selling. Walter's first reaction was to laugh. 52 acres of desert? What are we supposed to do with that, Bea? Start a cactus farm? But something about Uncle Cornelius's message intrigued me. He'd been eccentric, but he'd also been surprisingly shrewd about money. How else could a railroad worker afford to own 52 acres of land, even if it was in the middle of nowhere? When Walter suggested we sell it immediately and use the money for a family vacation or maybe some home improvements, I surprised both of us by asking if we could hold on to it for a while. Why? Walter asked, genuinely puzzled. Call it intuition, or maybe just curiosity. Uncle Cornelius was strange, but he wasn't stupid. If he thought this land might be worth something someday, maybe we should trust his judgment. Walter grumbled about paying property taxes on worthless desert, but he agreed to let me handle the inheritance however I thought best. We put the deed in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. Not our regular bank, but a smaller institution where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. For the first few years, the annual property taxes were less than $50. We'd get occasional letters from developers or real estate speculators asking if we were interested in selling, but the offers were laughably small, usually between $500 and $2,000 for the entire 52 acres. I ignored them all. By the late 1980s, the letters were arriving more frequently, and the offers had increased to $5,000, then $10,000. Walter started paying more attention to the mail. Maybe we should take one of these offers, Bea, he suggested in 1989, waving a letter offering $15,000. $15,000 would let us remodel the kitchen and take that cruise you've been talking about. But I'd started researching Scottsdale's growth patterns at the public library. What I discovered made me even more determined to hold on to Uncle Cornelius's gift. Scottsdale was expanding rapidly, with new housing developments and golf courses popping up every year. The city was growing in all directions, and our 52 acres were directly in the path of that expansion. Give it 5 more years, I told Walter. If it's still worthless desert in 1995, we'll sell it and take that cruise. 1995 came and went, and the offers had reached $50,000. Walter was getting harder to convince. $50,000, B. That's more money than we've ever had in our savings account. We could pay off the house, buy a new car, maybe even help the kids with college expenses for the grandchildren. But by then, I'd been watching Scottsdale's development even more carefully. New subdivisions were sprouting up within 10 miles of our property. The city's master plan showed major road improvements planned for the area. Most convincingly, a luxury resort had just broken ground only 15 miles away. 5 more years, I negotiated, just 5 more years, and if I'm wrong, you can say, I told you so, for the rest of our lives. Walter lived to see me proven right, though he never lived to see just how right I would be. By 2000, the year before Walter died, we were receiving offers of $200,000. Walter was amazed, but he was also starting to show signs of the heart disease that would take his life the following year. You were right about that desert, Bee, he said one evening, as we sat in our backyard watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Should we sell it? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Walter shook his head slowly. Not yet. Something tells me Uncle Cornelius would want us to wait a little longer. Besides, he smiled and took my hand, it's been kind of fun having a secret from the kids, hasn't it? It was the last conversation we ever had about the land. Walter died 3 months later, and I was too consumed by grief and my children's relentless pressure to think about distant real estate investments. For the first few years after Walter's death, while I was adjusting to life in Melissa's guest room and then Christopher's garage, I continued ignoring the letters from developers and real estate agents. The property taxes had grown to several $100s annually, but I managed to pay them quietly from the small personal allowance my children grudgingly provided from my trust fund. It wasn't until 2010, nearly 10 years after Walter's death, that I decided to investigate what Uncle Cornelius's land might actually be worth. I was feeling particularly invisible that week, particularly aware of how completely my children had erased my autonomy and dignity. Christopher had just informed me that they'd decided to reduce my monthly personal allowance from $200 to $150 because expenses were getting out of hand. And Sandra had made several pointed comments about elderly people who didn't appreciate the sacrifices their families made for them. That's when I asked Christopher's teenage son, my grandson Tyler, to help me with something on the computer. Sure, Grandma Bee, Tyler said, though I could tell he was only being polite. What do you need? I want to look up some information about property values in Scottsdale. There's some land I inherited from your great-great-uncle years ago, and I'm curious what it might be worth now.
Tyler was happy to help, especially when I offered to pay him $20 from my dwindling personal allowance. Within an hour, he'd pulled up satellite images, property value estimates, and recent sales data for comparable land in the area. What we discovered made my heart race, and my hands tremble so violently that I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to compose myself. My 52 acres of worthless desert were now surrounded by luxury housing developments, high-end golf courses, and resort properties. The satellite images showed that our land was one of the last undeveloped parcels in an area that had become some of the most desirable real estate in Arizona. Conservative estimates put the value at $1.8 million. Optimistic projections suggested it could be worth as much as $3.5 million, depending on zoning possibilities and development potential. $3.5 million. I was sitting in Christopher's converted garage, wearing clothes from the Goodwill, eating generic cereal for breakfast, and apologizing for the burden of my existence, while secretly owning property worth more money than my children had ever dreamed of possessing. That night, lying on the fold-out bed that had been my home for nearly a decade, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to tell them about the land, not while they treated me like an incompetent burden, not while they controlled every penny of my trust fund, not while they spoke about me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a human being who deserved respect and dignity. Instead, I was going to let them continue believing exactly what they'd always believed about their poor, helpless mother. And someday, when I was gone and they were settling my pathetic estate, they would discover just how wrong they'd been about everything. But first, I had some very careful planning to do. Over the next several months, I began laying the groundwork for what would become my masterpiece of poetic justice. Using the public library's computers when Christopher thought I was attending senior center activities, I researched estate planning, will preparation, and trust law. I learned about tax implications, charitable giving, and exactly how to structure my final wishes to achieve maximum impact. Most importantly, I contacted Eugene Bartwell, the lawyer who had originally handled Uncle Cornelius's estate. Now in his 70s himself, Eugene was still practicing law and remembered both Uncle Cornelius and the desert land inheritance perfectly. "Mrs. Henley," he said when I finally called him, "I've been wondering about that property for years. Have you been keeping track of what's happening in that area?" "I have," I said quietly, "and I think it's time Uncle Cornelius's gift served its true purpose." Eugene understood immediately. Over the following weeks, we worked together to create an estate plan that would honor Uncle Cornelius's memory while teaching my children a lesson they would never forget. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. My children thought they were managing my entire financial life, but they'd never known about the Arizona land because it predated Walter's death and their takeover of my affairs. The tax properties were modest enough that I could continue paying them from my personal allowance without arousing suspicion. And because the land was in my name only, Uncle Cornelius had left it specifically to Walter's wife Beatrice rather than to both of us. It would pass directly through my estate rather than being subject to any of the trust arrangements my children had created. For 13 years, I've been perfecting my performance as the grateful, dependent mother who needs their constant oversight. I've apologized for being a burden, thanked them for their sacrifices, and never once hinted that I might be capable of independent thought or action, while secretly owning property worth more money than my children had ever dreamed of possessing. But my patience is running out, and my health isn't what it used to be. Next month, I'll be 75, and I can feel time pressing against me like desert wind against the window of Christopher's garage. It's time to put my plan into motion. Time to ensure that when my children gather to hear the reading of my will, they'll finally understand exactly who their helpless mother really was. And time to make sure that Uncle Cornelius's final gift creates the kind of shock that will echo through my family for generations to come. The look on their faces when they discover the truth will be worth every cold night I've spent on this fold-out bed, every condescending conversation I've endured, and every moment of dignity I've sacrificed to maintain this charade. They think they know everything about their poor, dependent mother. They have no idea what's coming. The turning point came on a scorching Tuesday afternoon in July 2019 when my 4 children called what they dramatically termed an emergency family meeting to discuss my deteriorating situation. I knew I was in trouble the moment I saw all 4 cars parked in Christopher's driveway at the same time, something that only happened during major holidays or family crises. I was sitting in my usual spot in the garage when Sandra knocked on the door with that fake smile she reserved for particularly unpleasant conversations. "Beatrice, the family wants to have a little chat with you in the living room," she said, using the tone people employ when addressing mental patients or unruly children. "They've all driven over specially to see you."
The living room felt like a courtroom when I entered. My 4 children were arranged in a semicircle on Christopher's furniture, each clutching folders and looking appropriately somber. Jonathan sat in the center like a judge, his engineering calculator and laptop positioned on the coffee table like evidence in a prosecution. Melissa had brought a stack of what looked like medical pamphlets, while Amanda was frantically typing notes on her phone. Christopher looked uncomfortable in his own living room, clearly wishing this intervention was happening anywhere but his house. "Please sit down, Mother," Jonathan said formally, gesturing to a single chair they'd positioned facing their semicircle. The setup was so obviously designed to make me feel outnumbered and defensive that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I shuffled over to the chair with the careful, uncertain movements they expected from their fragile, elderly mother. "We need to have a serious conversation about your future," Melissa began, consulting her notes like she was delivering a prepared statement. "We've been discussing your living situation, your health, and your financial needs, and we're all very concerned." Concerned. That word again. In my children's vocabulary, concerned was code for about to make decisions you won't like. "What kind of concerns?" I asked softly, playing my role perfectly. Jonathan cleared his throat and opened his laptop. "Mother, you're 74 years old. Over the past few months, we've noticed some troubling changes in your behavior and cognitive function." Cognitive function. The phrase hit me like a slap. They weren't just treating me like a burden anymore. They were suggesting I was losing my mind. "What changes?" I asked, though part of me already knew what was coming. Amanda looked up from her phone. "Well, last month you asked me 3 times about your doctor's appointment, and you've been forgetting conversations we've had. You put salt in your coffee instead of sugar 2 weeks ago," Christopher added helpfully. "And you've been asking repetitive questions about your finances," Melissa chimed in. "You seem confused about where your money is and how much you have." I stared at them in amazement. The salt and coffee incident had happened exactly once, at 6 in the morning when I was barely awake in their dimly lit kitchen. The repetitive questions about my finances were my attempts to understand how they were spending my trust fund money. And yes, I had asked Amanda about my doctor's appointment multiple times, because she kept giving me different answers about the date and time. But they had taken these perfectly normal moments of confusion or persistent curiosity and transformed them into evidence of mental decline. "We think it might be time to consider some additional support for you," Jonathan continued, clicking through what appeared to be a PowerPoint presentation he'd prepared for this ambush. "We've been researching options that would ensure you get the care you need, while also giving our families some peace of mind." Options. I'd lived long enough to know that when children start talking about options for their elderly parents, those options rarely include anything the parent would actually choose for themselves. "What kind of options?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Melissa leaned forward with what she probably thought was a reassuring expression. "We've toured several lovely facilities in the area, places where you'd have your own apartment, but also access to medical care, meal preparation, social activities with people your own age." Facilities. They weren't even pretending these were anything other than nursing homes. "The costs are significant," Jonathan admitted, pulling up what appeared to be a financial spreadsheet he'd prepared for this ambush. "But we've run the numbers, and with your trust fund and Social Security, we can make it work. We might need to liquidate some of your remaining assets, but we can cover a nice place for at least 8 to 10 years. 8 to 10 years. They'd calculated exactly how long they expected me to live and were planning accordingly. "I don't understand," I said, letting genuine confusion creep into my voice. "I thought I was doing fine here with Christopher and Sandra." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Christopher shifted in his seat, and I caught Sandra making a face in the kitchen doorway. "Mom," said Christopher carefully, "it's not that you're not welcome here. It's just, well, Sandra and I have been talking, and we think you might be happier somewhere with more structure." Structure, another euphemism. What he meant was supervision. "The truth is, Mother," Amanda said, setting down her phone and adopting the patient tone she used with her own teenagers, "we're all worried about leaving you alone for extended periods. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? What if you got confused and wandered off?" Wandered off, like I was a dementia patient who might forget where I lived. "We love you, Mom," Melissa added quickly, "but we're not qualified to provide the level of care you're starting to need. These facilities have trained staff, medical professionals on site, and programs designed specifically for people in your situation." People in my situation. Elderly people whose families had decided they were too much trouble to deal with at home. I looked around the semicircle of faces. My children. The babies I had fed and changed and rocked to sleep. The toddlers I had taught to walk and talk.
The teenagers I had supported through heartbreaks and homework struggles. The young adults I had helped with college expenses and wedding costs and down payments on their first homes. Not one of them was looking directly at me. They were all studying their folders or their phones or the coffee table, anywhere but my face, because somewhere deep down they knew what they were doing was wrong.
How much would this cost? I asked quietly. Jonathan consulted his spreadsheet. The nicest place we found is Sunset Manor, and they have an opening in their assistant living wing. It would be $4,200 a month, which includes meals, housekeeping, basic medical monitoring, and social activities. $4,200 a month, over $50,000 a year. In less than 6 years, they would have spent every penny of my house money, money that was supposed to last for the rest of my life. That seems like a lot, I said carefully. It is a lot, Amanda agreed. But Mom, you can't put a price on safety and proper care. Besides, it's not like you're spending money on anything else right now. Not spending money on anything else, because they controlled every penny I had and gave me a $150 monthly allowance like I was a child receiving an allowance for doing chores. What if I don't want to go to a facility? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Another uncomfortable silence. Finally, Jonathan closed his laptop and leaned forward with the expression he'd worn when delivering bad news throughout his entire adult life. Mother, we've been researching the situation extensively. If you're not capable of making sound decisions about your own care and safety, we may need to explore legal options to ensure you get the help you need. Legal options. The threat was clear even though he'd wrapped it in euphemisms. If I didn't voluntarily agree to be warehoused in a nursing home, they would try to have me declared incompetent and force me into one. We don't want it to come to that, Melissa said quickly. We're hoping you'll understand that this is what's best for everyone. Best for everyone? Certainly best for them. No more elderly mother cluttering up Christopher's garage. No more guilt about my living conditions. No more responsibility for my day-to-day care. They could visit me once a week at Sunset Manor, bring me flowers and generic chocolates, and tell themselves they were wonderful children who had ensured their mother's golden years were comfortable and safe. Can I think about it? I asked, playing for time while my mind raced through the implications of what they were proposing. Of course, Jonathan said, though his tone suggested my thinking time would be limited. But we do need a decision fairly soon. The opening at Sunset Manor won't wait indefinitely, and frankly, the longer we delay, the fewer options we'll have. The meeting broke up with awkward hugs and promises to talk again soon. My children gathered their folders and left, each one telling me they loved me and were only trying to do what was best. After they left, I sat alone in Christopher's garage, staring at the concrete walls that had been my prison for over a decade, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not heartbreak. I'd moved past heartbreak years ago. This was something harder and colder. This was the death of the last shred of hope I'd been carrying that my children might someday remember they were supposed to love me rather than manage me. That night, I called Eugene Bartwell from the payphone outside the grocery store where Christopher dropped me off for my weekly shopping. I'd been planning to wait longer, to let my secret simmer for a few more years, but my children had just accelerated my timeline considerably. Eugene, it's Beatrice Henley. I need to make some changes to my estate planning, and I need to make them quickly. What's happened, Beatrice? His voice was sharp with concern. I told him about the family meeting, the nursing home plans, and the legal threats. When I finished, Eugene was quiet for a long moment. How quickly do they expect an answer? He asked finally. Soon, maybe a week or two. Then we need to move fast. Can you get away for a few hours this week? We have work to do. 3 days later, I told Christopher I was attending a senior center lecture on arthritis management, one of the appropriate activities for people my age that Amanda was always encouraging me to pursue. Instead, I took 2 buses across Phoenix to Eugene's office, where we spent 4 hours crafting what would become my masterpiece of posthumous justice. The beauty of Uncle Cornelius's gift wasn't just the land itself. though that 52-acre parcel was now worth an estimated $3.2 million according to Eugene's research. The real beauty was that my children had no idea it existed. They thought they knew everything about my finances, but the Arizona property predated their takeover of my life by nearly 20 years. "Here's what we're going to do," Eugene explained, spreading documents across his desk. "We're going to create a new will that ensures your children learn some very important lessons about the woman they've been treating like a burden." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Upon my death, the $3.2 million property would not go to my children. Instead, it would fund a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting elderly people who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families. The foundation would provide legal aid, emergency housing, and advocacy services for seniors facing exactly the kind of situation my children were trying to force me into. "We'll also include a provision," Eugene said with a slight smile, "that if any of them contest the will or attempt to claim the property was hidden from them deliberately, the entire estate will immediately transfer to a second charity, one dedicated to educating families about elder abuse."
Elder abuse. That's what it was, though I'd never used those words to describe my children's treatment of me. They weren't hitting me or stealing my money directly, but they had systematically stripped away my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to make decisions about my own life. "There's one more thing we should consider," Eugene said carefully. "If your children are planning to have you declared incompetent, we need to ensure this will is legally bulletproof. I'd like to arrange for you to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation by a neutral professional. Someone who can document your mental competency in case anyone tries to claim you weren't capable of making these decisions." 2 weeks later, I spent an entire day with Dr. Patricia Vance, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children thought I was losing my mind, when in reality, I was probably thinking more clearly and strategically than I had in decades. Dr. Vance put me through every test imaginable: memory assessments, logical reasoning problems, financial comprehension questions, and detailed interviews about my life history and decision-making processes. When she finished, she was almost laughing. "Mrs. Henley, I don't know what your family has been telling you, but your cognitive function is completely normal for someone your age. Better than normal, actually. You show no signs whatsoever of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would affect your decision-making capacity." The official report she prepared was 23 pages of detailed documentation proving that Beatrice Henley was mentally competent, financially aware, and fully capable of making independent decisions about her own life and estate. Meanwhile, my children's pressure campaign intensified. They started visiting more frequently, always bringing brochures for different care facilities and spreadsheets showing how my trust fund money could be allocated to pay for them. They spoke about my declining condition like it was an established fact, rather than their collective opinion. "Mom, we really need to make a decision soon," Melissa said during one particularly uncomfortable visit. "I've been reading about these things, and cognitive decline can accelerate quickly once it starts. We don't want to wait until you're no longer capable of participating in the decision." The manipulation was so blatant, it took my breath away. They were using the threat of my supposed mental decline to pressure me into making the decision they wanted, while I was still competent enough for it to be legally binding.
Dr. Harrison ate it up. Within an hour, he had diagnosed me with mild cognitive impairment with progression toward dementia and recommended immediate placement in a supervised care facility. My children were thrilled. Finally, they had the professional ammunition they needed to override my objections and proceed with their plans. What they didn't know was that I had recorded the entire appointment on a small device Eugene had provided, capturing Dr. Harrison's leading questions and my deliberately misleading responses.
More importantly, they had no idea that Dr. Vance's comprehensive evaluation, conducted just weeks earlier, would make Dr. Harrison's rushed assessment look like the biased sham it actually was. Within a month, they had moved me into Sunset Manor, a sterile facility that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. My room was a 12 by 12 box with a single window looking out at a parking lot, furnished with a narrow bed, a plastic chair, and a dresser that wouldn't have been acceptable in a college dormitory. The staff treated me like a combination of child and invalid, speaking loudly and slowly, helping me with tasks I was perfectly capable of handling myself, and maintaining detailed records of my daily activities like I was a prisoner under constant surveillance. But the worst part wasn't the institutional food or the rigid schedule or the other residents who actually did suffer from the conditions my children had falsely attributed to me. The worst part was how relieved and proud my children seemed about the decision they had made. "Mom, doesn't this feel safer?" Melissa asked during her first visit, looking around my tiny room like she was admiring a luxury hotel suite. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Everything is taken care of for you." Everything was taken care of by strangers who viewed me as a job rather than a person, using money that was supposed to support me in my own home for the rest of my life. "The staff here is wonderful," Amanda added, patting my hand condescendingly. "And look at all the activities they have planned. Arts and crafts, bingo, movie nights. It's like a resort for senior citizens." A resort where I couldn't leave, couldn't make my own food choices, couldn't control my own schedule, and couldn't have any privacy or personal space. But sure, it was exactly like a resort. Jonathan, ever the practical engineer, was most excited about the financial efficiency of their solution. "We're actually saving money compared to what we were spending on your care before," he told me proudly. "And now we don't have to worry about any unexpected expenses or emergency situations." They had warehoused me in the cheapest care facility that would accept Dr. Harrison's diagnosis, congratulated themselves on their fiscal responsibility, and washed their hands of any further obligation to think about my needs or preferences. For 3 months, I played the role of the compliant nursing home resident. I attended the mandatory activities, ate the institutional meals, and allowed the staff to help me with tasks I didn't need assistance with. I smiled and nodded when my children visited, thanked them for making such wise decisions on my behalf, and never once hinted that I was anything other than the confused, helpless woman they believed me to be. But I was also making plans. Every Tuesday, when the facility van took residents to the nearby shopping center for supervised errands, I would slip away for 20 minutes to call Eugene from a payphone outside the pharmacy. "How much longer can you stand this?" he asked during one of our calls. "As long as it takes," I replied. "I want them to get comfortable with their decision. I want them to congratulate themselves on solving the problem of their burdensome mother. And then I want them to live with the consequences of what they've done for the rest of their lives." The consequences were already taking shape in Eugene's office. The new will was complete, the charitable foundation was established, and Dr. Vance's competency evaluation was ready to destroy any attempt they might make to contest my final decisions. But there was one more element I wanted to add to their punishment, one final twist that would ensure my children understood exactly what their treatment of me had cost them. "Eugene," I said during my last phone call from that payphone outside the pharmacy, "I want to make sure they know that I was completely aware of what they were doing to me and that I chose to let them do it. I want them to understand that their helpless mother was always 10 steps ahead of them." "What did you have in mind?" I smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time since Walter's death. I want to write them each a personal letter to be delivered with the will. Letters that explain exactly how long I've been planning this, exactly how much I knew about their real motivations, and exactly what they've lost by treating me like a burden instead of their mother. 3 weeks later, I was dead. Officially from complications related to pneumonia, but really from a heart that had finally grown too tired of beating for people who saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved. What my children discovered at the reading of my will would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But that's a story for the next part of this tale. All I knew as I drew my final breath in that sterile nursing home room was that Uncle Cornelius would be proud of how I used his gift, and Walter would be amazed at how patient I had been in planning the perfect revenge. The woman they had dismissed as a confused, helpless burden was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives.
Living in Sunset Manor was like existing in a carefully controlled purgatory. But it also gave me something I hadn't had in decades: time and privacy to execute the final phase of my plan. While my children congratulated themselves on solving the problem of their burdensome mother, I was methodically gathering evidence and building a case that would expose exactly what kind of people they had become. The nursing home routine was mind-numbing by design. Breakfast at 7 sharp. Medication distribution at 8, morning activities from 9 to 11, lunch at noon, mandatory rest time until 2, afternoon activities until 4, dinner at 5:30, evening medication at 7, and lights out at 9. It was a schedule designed to keep residents docile and manageable, treating grown adults like kindergarten children who couldn't be trusted to structure their own days. But this rigid routine also meant I could predict exactly when I would have opportunities to work on my real project without being observed or interrupted. During the mandatory rest periods, when other residents napped or stared at daytime television, I would sit by my small window with a notebook I'd asked Amanda to bring me for writing down memories. She'd been delighted by this request, seeing it as evidence that I was finally embracing appropriate activities for someone in my condition. What I was actually doing was documenting 23 years of systematic emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and deliberate isolation. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, every decision they had made on my behalf without consultation, every time they had dismissed my opinions or treated me like an incompetent child. The pattern that emerged was even more damaging than I had realized while I was living through it. My children hadn't just taken control of my finances after Walter's death, they had systematically dismantled every aspect of my independence and self-determination. They had isolated me from my few remaining friends by moving me away from my neighborhood and claiming I was too fragile for social visits. They had taken over my medical care, speaking to doctors on my behalf and making decisions about my treatment without including me in the conversations. They had controlled my diet, my clothing choices, my daily activities, and even my access to information about my own financial situation. Most devastatingly, they had gaslighted me into believing that their control was evidence of their love and concern, rather than a systematic campaign to strip away my autonomy and dignity. But documenting the abuse was only part of my investigation. I also needed to understand exactly how my children had been managing the trust fund money they claimed was being used for my care. This required more creativity since I obviously couldn't access bank records or financial statements from my nursing home room, but I had learned over the years that people often reveal more than they intend when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't understand or won't remember the details. During their weekly visits, I began asking innocent questions about family finances, expressing confusion about how expensive things had become, and wondering aloud about how they were managing to afford their various lifestyle improvements while also paying for my care. "The nursing home must be so expensive," I said to Melissa during one visit, using the worried tone of someone who felt guilty about being a financial burden. "It hopes it's not causing problems for your families."
Oh, don't worry about that, Mom. We're managing fine. Actually, we were able to refinance our house last year at a much better interest rate, so our monthly expenses are actually lower now than they were before. Interesting. She had refinanced her house, something that typically requires significant equity or improved income, at the same time she was supposedly struggling with the costs of my care. That's wonderful, dear. I worry so much about being expensive for everyone. Mom, you're not expensive at all compared to some of the places we looked at. And besides, Jonathan found some really good investment opportunities for your trust fund money, so it's actually growing even while we're using it for your expenses. Investment opportunities. My trust fund money was apparently being invested rather than simply spent on my care, but I was receiving no benefit from any growth in those investments. And I certainly hadn't been consulted about the risk of losing principal in speculative investments. Over the following weeks, I gathered similar information from each of my children. Christopher mentioned that he and Sandra had been able to take a vacation to Hawaii for the first time in years. Amanda talked about finally being able to afford private music lessons for her daughter. Jonathan casually mentioned purchasing a new boat. All of them were enjoying improved lifestyles and new luxuries while their mother lived in a sterile room eating institutional food and following a schedule designed for people with severe dementia. But the most damaging information came from overhearing conversations they thought I couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. During one visit, Jonathan and Melissa stepped into the hallway to discuss something they obviously didn't want me to hear. But the walls at Sunset Manor were thin, and my hearing was much better than they believed. I heard, "The Hawaii trip was expensive, but we deserved it after everything we've been dealing with," Melissa said. I know. Sometimes I feel like we should be getting paid for all the work we do managing her affairs. Do you know how much time I spend on her investment portfolio alone? Jonathan replied.
Investment portfolio? He was spending time managing my money like it was a hobby or side business, making decisions that affected my financial security without any input from me.
Mrs. Henley, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of financial exploitation and emotional abuse of an elderly person. Your children appear to have used coercion and false medical claims to gain control over your life and your assets. Is there anything I can do about it? Margaret smiled grimly. There are several things we can do. But first, I want to arrange for you to be evaluated by an independent geriatric psychiatrist, someone who specializes in competency assessments and has no connection to your family or their chosen doctors. I've already been evaluated by Dr. Patricia Vance. My lawyer has the reports. Margaret's eyebrows rose. You have a lawyer? I do. And I've been working with him on some plans for my estate. Plans that my children don't know about. Mrs. Henley, I think you and I need to have a much longer conversation. And I think I need to speak with your lawyer. Over the following weeks, Margaret worked with Eugene Bartwell to build a comprehensive case documenting the abuse I had suffered at my children's hands. They gathered medical records, financial documents, and testimony from facility staff about my actual mental condition versus the declining, confused woman my family had described to justify their decisions. But more importantly, they helped me understand that what I had been planning, the posthumous revelation of my hidden assets in the charitable foundation, was more than just poetic justice. It was a legal statement that would expose my children's behavior and potentially protect other elderly people from suffering similar treatment. Your will and the documentation we're building will serve as evidence that your children systematically exploited and abused you while claiming to act in your best interests, Margaret explained during one of our meetings. But Mrs. Henley, you don't have to wait until you're dead to take action. We could pursue legal remedies now. I considered this option carefully. I could fight to regain my independence, challenge the guardianship arrangements, and expose what my children had done while I was still alive to see the consequences. But there was something deeply satisfying about the idea of maintaining my secret until the very end, letting them continue believing they had successfully managed and controlled their burdensome mother, only to discover after my death that the woman they had dismissed as mentally incompetent
had been 10 steps ahead of them the entire time. No, I told Margaret. I want them to learn the truth the same way I learned about Uncle Cornelius's gift, from a lawyer, after the person who outsmarted them is no longer around to see their faces. Are you sure? You could reclaim your life right now. I looked around my sterile nursing home room, thought about the years of condescending treatment and systematic abuse, and felt that familiar, cold satisfaction settle in my chest. I'm sure, but I want to make sure that the truth comes out. It comes out in a way that exposes exactly what kind of people my children are. I want other families to hear this story and think twice before they decide their elderly relatives are burdens to be managed rather than people to be respected. Margaret nodded slowly. In that case, we're going to make sure your final statement is heard loud and clear. That evening, I called Eugene from the payphone in the nursing home lobby during the 30-minute period when residents were allowed to make personal calls. Eugene, I've been working with an elder care advocate named Margaret Foster. She's helped me understand that what my children did to me wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. What are you thinking, Beatrice? I'm thinking that when they read my will, I want them to understand that they didn't just lose an inheritance they never knew existed. I want them to understand that they committed crimes against their own mother and that the world is going to know exactly what they did. How public do you want to make this? I thought about my granddaughter being told that her grandmother was too mentally impaired to make her own decisions. I thought about other elderly people being manipulated and controlled by family members who claimed to love them. I thought about the systematic way my children had erased my personhood while congratulating themselves on their compassion and responsibility. As public as possible, Eugene. I want this story told in a way that makes people think twice before they assume their elderly relatives are too confused or helpless to deserve basic respect and dignity. Then we have a lot of work to do. Over my final months at Sunset Manor, Eugene and Margaret worked together to create what would become not just my will, but a comprehensive legal document that exposed the full extent of my children's abuse and manipulation. The document included testimony from medical professionals about my actual mental capacity, financial records showing how my trust fund money had been misused, and detailed accounts of the systematic way my autonomy had been stripped away from me. But more importantly, the personal centerpiece were several letters I wrote to each of my children, explaining exactly what they had lost and why they had lost it. These letters would be read out loud during the formal will reading, ensuring that Jonathan, Melissa, Christopher, and Amanda heard every word of their mother's final judgment on their behavior.
Jonathan, you always prided yourself on being the smart one, the practical one who could handle complicated financial decisions that confused your poor old mother. You spent years managing my trust fund like it was a challenging math problem, making investment choices and allocation decisions without ever asking what I might want or need. You calculated the minimum possible cost for my care and congratulated yourself on your efficiency. What you never calculated was the cost of treating my mother like a financial burden rather than a human being. The $3.2 million you will never inherit was Uncle Cornelius's reward for patience and vision. Your impatience and short-sightedness have cost you everything. The letter to Melissa addressed her role as my healthcare advocate and her willingness to support false medical claims about my mental capacity. Melissa, you were supposed to be my daughter, but you became my warden instead. You participated in having me declared mentally incompetent based on manufactured evidence and biased medical opinions. You spoke to doctors on my behalf, made decisions about my care without consulting me, and told my granddaughter that her grandmother was too confused to be trusted with basic decisions about her own life. You chose to believe I was declining mentally because it was more convenient than treating me like a competent adult with valid opinions and preferences. Your willingness to sacrifice the truth for convenience has cost you an inheritance that could have changed your family's life forever. The letter to Christopher was perhaps the most personal since I had lived in his garage for over a decade.
Christopher, you provided me with shelter, and I am grateful for that. But you also provided me with daily reminders that I was unwelcome in your life, a burden you were grudgingly shouldering out of family obligation. You charged me rent to live in your converted garage, then complained when that rent didn't cover all the inconveniences of housing your elderly mother. You made me feel like a refugee in my own family, someone who should be grateful for any accommodation, no matter how grudging or uncomfortable. You chose to see me as an expense to be minimized, rather than a mother who deserved love and respect. That choice cost you $3.2 million that will now help other elderly people who have been treated like burdens by their own families. And the letter to Amanda addressed her role in coordinating the family's campaign to have me institutionalized. Amanda, you were my baby, the child I thought would always see me as more than just an aging problem to be solved. Instead, you became the coordinator of my destruction, organizing family meetings to discuss my declining condition, researching nursing homes to warehouse me in, and lying to your own daughter about your grandmother's mental capacity. You taught your child that elderly people become confused and helpless, and that loving families make decisions for them rather than with them. You chose to see me as a diagnosis rather than a person. That diagnosis has cost you an inheritance that would have secured your daughter's educational future and your family's financial security. Each letter ended with the same message. The woman you dismissed as confused and helpless was always 10 steps ahead of you. The mother you treated like a burden was sitting on millions of dollars while watching you calculate the cheapest possible cost of my care. You lost this inheritance not because I didn't love you, but because you forgot how to love me as a person rather than manage me as a problem. By the time I had finished writing these letters and working with Eugene and Margaret to finalize the legal documentation, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced since Walter's death. My children had spent 23 years systematically erasing my personhood, but my final act would restore it in the most dramatic way possible. I was ready to die knowing that Uncle Cornelius's gift would serve its ultimate purpose, not just as a financial inheritance, but as a final lesson about the importance of treating elderly people with dignity and respect rather than condescension and control. The only question remaining was how much longer my heart would keep beating. I was 75 years old, my health was declining under the stress of institutional living, and I could feel my body preparing to let go of a life that had become more performance than genuine existence. But I needed to hold on just a little longer, just until Eugene and Margaret had finished building the case that would expose my children's abuse and ensure that my story would be heard by people who needed to hear it. The final phase of my plan was almost complete. Soon, my children would discover that their confused, helpless mother had been the smartest person in the room all along. My health began declining rapidly in the spring of 2023, almost as if my body had been waiting for my mind to complete its work before allowing me to rest. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of my children claiming I was mentally deteriorating when I was actually sharper than ever, my physical condition was finally catching up to the frail, declining woman they had always insisted I was. Dr. Reynolds, the nursing home staff physician, noticed the change first. "Mrs. Henley, your blood pressure has been elevated for several weeks now, and you're showing signs of cardiac stress. Have you been feeling more tired lately? Any chest pain or shortness of breath?" I had been experiencing all of those symptoms, but I'd been attributing them to the stress of finalizing my plans and the emotional toll of documenting decades of abuse. Now it seemed my heart was literally growing tired of the charade I had been maintaining for so long.
"A little tired, yes," I admitted. "But that's normal for someone my age, isn't it?" Dr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and looked at me with the kind of gentle concern I hadn't seen from a medical professional since Walter's death. "Mrs. Henley, age alone doesn't cause these symptoms. I think we need to run some tests and possibly adjust your medications. I'm also going to recommend some changes to your activity level and diet." What struck me most about this conversation was how different it was from every medical interaction I'd had since my children took control of my health care. Dr. Reynolds was talking to me directly, explaining his concerns and recommendations, asking for my input about symptoms and preferences. He was treating me like a competent adult who had the right to understand and participate in decisions about my own medical care. Doctor, can I ask you something? Of course. Do I seem confused or mentally impaired to you? Do you think I have dementia or cognitive decline? Dr. Reynolds looked genuinely puzzled. Mrs. Henley, you're one of the most mentally acute residents we have. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is clear, and you're more aware of current events and facility procedures than many people half your age. Why would you think you have cognitive problems? Because that's what my family was told. That's why they placed me here. Dr. Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd said. Mrs. Henley, I'm going to be very direct with you. Based on my observations and interactions with you over the past several months, there is no medical justification for your placement in this facility. You would be perfectly capable of living independently or in a less restrictive environment. Then why am I here? I think that's a question you should discuss with Margaret Foster, your advocate. But, Mrs. Henley, if you wanted to challenge your placement here, you would have very strong grounds for doing so. That afternoon, I called Eugene from the lobby payphone and told him about my conversation with Dr. Reynolds. Eugene, my health is declining, but my mind is clearer than it's been in years. Dr. Reynolds confirmed what Dr. Vance documented. There's nothing wrong with my cognitive function. How much time do you think you have, Beatrice? It was a blunt question, but Eugene and I had moved beyond polite euphemisms months ago. I don't know, maybe months, maybe a year, but probably not much longer than that. Then we need to finalize everything immediately. The will, the foundation documents, the evidence portfolio, all of it needs to be completed and legally bulletproof. There's something else I want to add, Eugene. I want to make sure that when this story comes out, it reaches people who can use it to help other families avoid making the same mistakes my children made. What do you have in mind? I want you to contact local media after my death. I want this story told publicly, not just shared with my family. I want other elderly people to know that they have rights and options, even when their families claim they're too confused to make decisions for themselves. Eugene was quiet for a moment. Beatrice, that would make this very public. Your children would face significant embarrassment and possibly legal consequences. Good. Maybe public shame will teach them something that private consequences wouldn't. And maybe other families will think twice before they decide their elderly relatives are too mentally impaired to deserve basic respect. Over the following weeks, Eugene worked with remarkable speed to finalize every aspect of my estate plan. The will was revised and notarized with multiple witnesses and extensive documentation of my mental competency. The charitable foundation was established with a board of directors that included Margaret Foster and 2 other elder care advocates. The evidence portfolio was organized into a comprehensive report that detailed every aspect of my children's systematic abuse and financial exploitation. But the element I was most proud of was the media component of my plan. Eugene had contacted Sandra Chen, an investigative journalist who specialized in stories about elder abuse and family exploitation. Sandra had agreed to tell my story after my death, using my case to highlight the broader problem of adult children who use false claims of mental decline to control their elderly parents. Your story has all the elements that make people pay attention, Sandra told me during a phone conversation Eugene had arranged. The secret inheritance, the systematic abuse, the false medical claims, and most importantly, the evidence that you were competent and aware throughout everything that was done to you. Will people believe it? Or will they think I'm just a bitter old woman making accusations against my family? Mrs. Henley, we have medical documentation from multiple professionals confirming your mental competency. We have financial records showing how your trust fund was misused. We have testimony from facility staff about the disconnect between your actual condition and what your family claimed about you. This isn't just your word against theirs. This is documented evidence of systematic elder abuse. The conversation gave me a satisfaction I hadn't felt since Walter's death.
My children thought they had successfully managed and controlled their burdensome mother, but they had actually created a detailed record of their own abusive behavior. Every condescending conversation, every decision made without my input, every time they had dismissed my preferences as evidence of mental decline, all of it would be exposed for the world to see.
But there was one more element I wanted to add to ensure maximum impact. I asked Eugene to arrange for video recordings of me discussing my situation to be released after my death alongside Sandra's news story. I want people to see that the woman who was supposedly too confused to manage her own affairs was actually lucid, articulate, and completely aware of what was being done to her, I explained. The video sessions took place over several afternoons in Eugene's office. I spoke directly to the camera, explaining my situation in my own words, detailing the systematic way my children had stripped away my autonomy, and describing the years of planning that had led to my final revenge. I want other elderly people to know that you don't have to accept being treated like a burden or a problem to be managed, I said in one segment. I want families to understand that aging doesn't automatically make someone incompetent, and that taking control of an elderly person's life without their consent is abuse, even when it's done by people who claim to love you. The most powerful segment addressed my children directly. Jonathan, Melissa, Christopher, and Amanda, you spent 23 years treating me like I was too confused and helpless to understand what you were doing to me. You were wrong. I understood everything, remembered everything, and planned accordingly. The mother you dismissed as mentally declining was always 10 steps ahead of you. I hope that someday you'll understand that you lost this inheritance not because I stopped loving you, but because you forgot how to love me as a person instead of managing me as a problem. By early fall of 2023, every aspect of my plan was in place. The legal documents were finalized and stored in Eugene's safe. The media contacts were established and ready to act after my death. The evidence portfolio was complete and devastating. The video recordings were edited and prepared for release. Most importantly, I had created a detailed timeline for how everything would unfold after my death. Eugene would contact my children within 24 hours to inform them of my passing and schedule the formal will reading for 1 week later. During that week, he would also contact Sandra Chen to begin the media investigation. The will reading would be recorded, with the participants' knowledge, to document their reactions when they learned about the inheritance they had lost. 3 days after the will reading, Sandra's news story would be published, accompanied by my video recordings and excerpts from the evidence portfolio. The story would be picked up by other media outlets, creating a public discussion about elder abuse and the rights of elderly people to make decisions about their own lives. It's going to be a very difficult week for your children, Eugene warned me during our final planning session. I've had 23 years to treat me with basic dignity and respect. They chose to treat me like a burden instead. Now, they get to experience the consequences of that choice. But even as I finalized these plans for posthumous justice, part of me hoped that my children might somehow redeem themselves before it was too late. I found myself watching for signs that they might remember how to see me as their mother, rather than as a problem they were managing. Those signs never came. During their weekly visits, they continued to speak to me like I was a child, continued to make decisions about my care without consulting me, and continued to congratulate themselves on the wise choices they had made regarding my living situation. "Mom, you seem so much more settled here than you were at Christopher's house," Melissa said during one visit, apparently oblivious to the irony of calling me settled when I was living in institutional care against my will. "The staff here is so good with you. They understand how to work with people who have your challenges." My challenges. The challenges of being treated like I was mentally impaired when I was actually more mentally acute than I'd been in years.
Are you comfortable here, Mom? Jonathan asked, though his tone suggested he was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern for my answer. I'm as comfortable as someone can be when they have no control over any aspect of their daily life, I replied quietly. He patted my hand condescendingly. I know it's been an adjustment, but this is really what's best for everyone. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Everything is taken care of for you. Everything was taken care of by strangers who viewed me as a job rather than a person, using money that was supposed to support me in dignity for the rest of my life. But Jonathan seemed genuinely to believe that this arrangement demonstrated his love and responsibility as a son. The final conversation I had with Christopher was perhaps the most revealing. He had come alone for once, without Sandra or their children, and seemed more reflective than usual. Mom, I want you to know that having you live with us for all those years, it wasn't always easy, but I'm glad we could help you when you needed it. Are you glad I'm here now instead of in your garage? I asked. Christopher looked uncomfortable. Well, this is better for you. You get proper care here, and you're around people who understand your condition. What condition is that, Christopher? You know, the memory problems, the confusion about financial things, the difficulty making decisions. Do you really believe I have memory problems and confusion? Or is that just what it's been convenient for all of you to believe?
He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Mom, of course you have those problems. That's why we had to make these arrangements for you. In that moment, I realized that my children hadn't been deliberately lying about my mental condition. They had actually convinced themselves that their narrative was true. They had spent so many years treating me like I was confused and helpless that they could no longer see evidence to the contrary. This realization made their betrayal somehow both more understandable and more tragic. They weren't evil people who had knowingly abused their mother. They were people who had gradually lost the ability to see me as anything other than the diminished version of myself they needed me to be to justify their actions. But understanding their psychology didn't change the consequences they would face for those actions. 2 weeks before my death, I had my final conversation with Eugene. Everything is ready, Beatrice. The moment you pass away, this plan will go into motion like clockwork. Eugene, do you think I'm being too harsh? Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to make them understand what they were doing to me. Beatrice, you spent 23 years trying to maintain relationships with people who systematically stripped away your dignity and autonomy. You asked questions about your finances and were told not to worry about complicated matters. You expressed preferences about your living situation and were told that you weren't capable of making good decisions. You tried to participate in choices about your own medical care and were excluded from conversations with your doctors. He was right. I had tried, repeatedly and in countless different ways, to maintain my personhood and relationships where I was valued only for my compliance and gratitude. Your children made their choices, Eugene continued. They chose to see you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Now they get to live with the consequences of those choices. And other families will learn from their mistakes? If our plan works the way we've designed it, yes, your story will help other elderly people understand their rights and options. It will help families recognize the difference between appropriate care and abusive control. And it will send a very clear message that treating elderly people like burdens or incompetence can have serious legal and financial consequences. I spent my final days at Sunset Manor in a state of peaceful anticipation. My body was failing, but my mind was clear and my conscience was clean. I had endured 23 years of systematic abuse and manipulation, but I had also spent those years planning the perfect response to that treatment. My children thought they had won by successfully warehousing their difficult mother in an institutional care facility where she could be managed by professionals and visited on a convenient schedule.
They had no idea that their victory was about to turn into the most expensive lesson of their lives. The night before I died, I lay in my narrow nursing home bed and thought about Walter, wondering what he would think of the elaborate revenge I had planned. I decided he would be amazed by my patience and impressed by my strategic thinking, but mostly he would be sad that our children had forced me to such extreme measures to reclaim my dignity. I thought about Uncle Cornelius, whose gift had made my revenge possible. He had known something about the value of patience and the importance of thinking beyond immediate circumstances. His desert land had taught me that sometimes the most worthless-looking gifts turn out to be the most valuable, and sometimes the people who seem most powerless are actually the ones holding all the cards. Most of all, I thought about the other elderly people who might benefit from my story. People who were being told they were too confused to make their own decisions, too forgetful to be trusted with their own finances, too frail to live according to their own preferences. People who were being managed and controlled by family members who claimed to love them while systematically erasing their personhood. I hoped my story would reach those people and help them understand that they had rights, options, and allies. I hoped it would help families recognize the difference between appropriate care and abusive control, and I hoped it would serve as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to treat their elderly relatives like problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. At 3:17 a.m. on October 15, 2023, my heart finally stopped beating. I died peacefully in my sleep, surrounded by the sterile efficiency of institutional care, but knowing that within hours, my carefully planned masterpiece would begin to unfold. My children thought they had buried their problem along with their mother. They had no idea that they had actually unleashed a reckoning that would expose their treatment of me to the world and cost them everything they never knew they had lost. The greatest irony of all was that if they had simply treated me with basic dignity and respect, they would have inherited $3.2 million without ever knowing how close they had come to losing it. Instead, their cruelty and condescension had cost them a fortune and earned them a place in the public record as examples of what happens when families forget that elderly people are still people who deserve to be treated with love rather than mere management. Uncle Cornelius's gift was finally ready to serve its ultimate purpose, not just as a financial inheritance, but as a lesson about the true cost of failing to recognize the dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their age or perceived helplessness. The reckoning was about to begin.
Eugene Bartwell made the phone calls at exactly 9 a.m. on October 16, 2023, 24 hours after my death. His voice was professionally neutral as he delivered the news to each of my 4 children. I'm calling to inform you that your mother, Beatrice Henley, passed away peacefully yesterday evening at Sunset Manor. I'll be handling her estate, and I need to schedule a formal will reading with all 4 of you present. The reactions were predictably varied. Jonathan immediately began asking practical questions about funeral arrangements and estate taxes. Melissa became emotional, though Eugene noted that her tears seemed more about guilt than genuine grief. Christopher sounded relieved that his long obligation was finally over. Amanda asked whether there would be any money left after paying for the nursing home costs and final expenses. The will reading is scheduled for October 23rd at 2 p.m. in my office, Eugene informed each of them. Arizona law requires all beneficiaries to be present, and there are some specific provisions your mother insisted on that require your personal attendance. None of them questioned this requirement. Why would they? They assumed they were gathering to divide up the modest remnants of their burdened mother's estate, maybe a few $1,000s left from the trust fund, some personal belongings, and the administrative details of closing out a life they had spent decades managing. My funeral was held 3 days later at a small chapel in Phoenix. The service was sparsely attended, just my 4 children and their families, a few residents from Sunset Manor who barely knew me, and Linda Martinez, the social worker who had tried to help me. Margaret Foster, my elder care advocate, sat quietly in the back row, observing everything with the sharp attention of someone who knew the real story.
The eulogies were exercises in revisionist history. Jonathan spoke about my brave struggle with declining health and how the family had worked together to ensure Mom got the care she needed. Melissa tearfully described me as a loving mother who taught us the importance of family responsibility. Christopher thanked everyone who had supported our family during Mom's difficult final years. Amanda talked about how I was finally at peace after struggling with confusion and memory problems. Not one of them mentioned the woman I had actually been, the sharp, aware, strategic person who had been planning their downfall for years while they congratulated themselves on managing their incompetent mother. Margaret Foster told me later, through Eugene, in a report that was added to my evidence file, that the most telling moment came when my granddaughter asked why I had seemed so unhappy during my final years if everyone had been taking such good care of me. The adults quickly changed the subject. The will reading took place exactly as I had planned it. My 4 children arrived at Eugene's office dressed in somber colors, carrying folders and calculators, prepared to divide up what they assumed would be a small estate consisting mainly of my remaining trust fund money and personal belongings. Eugene had arranged the seating carefully, my children in a semicircle facing his desk, just like they had arranged my chair during their interventions. The irony of the positioning was intentional. "Before we begin," Eugene announced, "I need to inform you that this reading is being recorded, as per your mother's specific instructions." She wanted to ensure that her final wishes were documented and clearly understood. Jonathan frowned. "Is that really necessary? This should be a private family matter." "Your mother's will contains some unusual provisions that she felt required careful documentation. Now, let's begin." He opened the file and began reading the standard legal language that opens most wills. My children settled back in their chairs, half listening to the formalities while mentally calculating how they would split whatever modest inheritance awaited them. Then Eugene reached the real substance of my will. "To my children, Jonathan, Melissa, Christopher, and Amanda, I leave the following message. You spent 23 years treating me like I was too confused and mentally impaired to understand what you were doing to me. You were wrong. I understood everything, remembered everything, and planned accordingly." The shift in the room was immediate. 4 heads snapped up, 4 faces showed the first flickers of confusion and concern. Eugene continued reading. "You systematically stripped away my autonomy, dignity, and right to make decisions about my own life. You used false claims about my mental capacity to justify controlling every aspect of my existence. You treated me like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Therefore, you will inherit nothing from my estate except the knowledge of what you have lost and why you lost it." Melissa gasped. Amanda's mouth fell open. Christopher looked around the room like he was searching for hidden cameras. Jonathan leaned forward, his face flushing red. "That's impossible," Jonathan said. "She didn't have anything to leave us anyway. The trust fund was almost depleted paying for her care." Eugene smiled coldly. "Your mother's primary asset was never part of the trust fund you managed. Let me continue reading." The next section detailed Uncle Cornelius's inheritance, the 52 acres of Arizona desert that had grown from worthless scrub brush into $3.2 million worth of prime Scottsdale real estate. This land, which I inherited in 1983 and held in secret for 40 years, will now fund the Cornelius Henley Foundation for Elder Justice, dedicated to helping elderly people who have been abused, exploited, or inappropriately institutionalized by their own families.
The silence in the room was deafening. Eugene let it stretch for a full minute before continuing with the personal letters I had written to each child. He read Jonathan's letter first, detailing his financial management of my trust fund and his failure to see me as anything more than a math problem to be solved efficiently. Jonathan's face went from red to pale as Eugene read my words about how his impatience and short-sightedness had cost him everything. Melissa's letter addressed her role in supporting false medical claims about my competency. She began crying as Eugene read my assessment of how her willingness to sacrifice the truth for convenience had cost her family's financial future. Christopher's letter was perhaps the most personal, acknowledging his shelter while condemning how he had made me feel like an unwelcome refugee in my own family. He stared at the floor as Eugene read about how treating me like an expense to be minimized had cost him millions. Amanda's letter focused on her coordination of my institutionalization and the lies she had told her own daughter about my mental capacity. She looked physically ill as Eugene read my words about how seeing me as a diagnosis rather than a person had cost her daughter's educational future. When Eugene finished reading the personal letters, Christopher finally found his voice. "This is insane. She was mentally impaired. She had dementia. Multiple doctors confirmed it." Eugene reached for another folder. "Actually, your mother was evaluated by Dr. Patricia Vance, a geriatric psychiatrist specializing in competency assessments. Dr. Vance found your mother to be completely mentally competent, with no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. She was also evaluated by Dr. Reynolds at Sunset Manor, who reached the same conclusion. The assessment you're thinking of was conducted by Dr. Harrison, who spent less than an hour with your mother and based his diagnosis on her deliberately misleading responses." He handed them copies of both competency evaluations, along with testimony from multiple facility staff members who had interacted with me regularly and found me to be mentally sharp and fully aware of my situation. "Your mother wasn't confused or mentally impaired. She was a competent adult who was systematically abused and exploited by her own children. And she documented every detail of that abuse for the past 2 years, with the help of elder care advocate Margaret Foster." The final blow came when Eugene played excerpts from my video recordings. My children watched in horror as their supposedly confused, helpless mother spoke directly to the camera with perfect clarity and devastating precision about exactly what they had done to her and why they were losing their inheritance. "You thought you were managing a problem," my recorded voice said, looking directly into the camera. "You were actually creating evidence of your own cruelty and incompetence as children. Every condescending conversation, every decision made without my input, every time you dismissed my preferences as symptoms of mental decline, all of it has been documented and will now be made public." The meeting ended with Eugene informing my children that Sandra Chen's investigative report would be published in 3 days, detailing their systematic abuse of their elderly mother and featuring the evidence they had unknowingly created through years of documented mistreatment. "Your mother wanted other families to learn from your mistakes," Eugene said as they sat in stunned silence. "Her story will help other elderly people understand their rights and options. It will help families recognize the difference between appropriate care and abusive control. And it will serve as a warning about the consequences of treating elderly relatives like burdens rather than people." 6 months after my death, Eugene sent a final report to Margaret Foster, detailing the Foundation's early successes in helping families recognize the difference between appropriate support and abusive control.
Beatrice got exactly what she wanted, Margaret told Eugene. Her children learned the true cost of their cruelty. Other families are being helped to avoid the same mistakes, and elderly people across the country are hearing the message that they don't have to accept being treated like burdens or problems to be managed. In the end, Uncle Cornelius's gift had served its perfect purpose, not just as financial revenge against my ungrateful children, but as a lasting legacy that would protect other elderly people from suffering the same systematic abuse I had endured for 23 years. My children thought they had buried their problem when they buried me.
Instead, they had unleashed a reckoning that would follow them for the rest of their lives and help countless other families understand that elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and the right to be treated as competent adults rather than problems to be solved. The woman they had dismissed as confused and helpless had been 10 steps ahead of them until the very end. What would you do if you were in my situation? Have you ever seen families treat elderly relatives this way? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what city you're watching from. Thank you for following this story to the end. Make sure to check out my other videos about standing up for yourself when no one else will.